Hey, great to see you. It's Chris, the Guitar Amp Tech from Sydney, Australia. Today we're continuing on our journey of exploring the secrets behind Tube Amp Sag. And this is our second installment where we're going to be looking at rectifiers and capacitors. If that sounds like something you might be interested in, go grab yourself a coffee, pull up a chair, sit down, and let's get stuck in. Before we look into the characteristics of different types of rectifiers, let me do a quick recap to make sure that you understand the function of a rectifier. I'll be referring to the Australian domestic mains of 240 volts at 50 hertz. So if you're in the USA, Canada, whatever, pretend I'm saying 120 volts and 60 hertz. So let's start at the beginning. Power stations generate alternating current. It's cheaper to make an alternating current generator than a DC generator, with much less high current arcing. But best of all, AC can be going through a transformer at the power station to raise the power up to extremely high levels of voltage. Remembering that power equals current times voltage, that means the higher the voltage, the lower the current to move a specific amount of power demand, to meet a specific power demand. Less current means less resistive loss, less money, less weight of the transmission line conductors. So how high a voltage is that? We're talking about 500,000 volts. And this is why AC/DC sang about high voltage. It's rock and roll, mate. Sorry, being silly. Once near its destination, the electricity will be reduced to 240 volts or 120, which comes out of your wall socket. You cannot run an amplifier in 240 volts of alternating current. However, that wall voltage can be fed into a primary side of our amp's power transformer. The secondary will put out high voltage, yes, and other voltages as well, but it's still AC. Our tubes would not be happy with this AC at all. They don't like AC. There would be a painful squeak as they expired. So let's do some magic and convert AC to DC. So this is what's coming out of our power transformer. We've got a sine wave, and it goes from 0 to positive to 0 to negative to positive to back to 0. Average is 0. We're not going to be able to make any use of this. So we've got to convert it to a positive signal. And one way we can do this is by getting rid of the negative side of it, this side of it. And we can do this by using a rectifier, a half-wave rectifier. And it is a diode. And if we put that in, it will get rid of, if in this direction, it's going to get rid of the bottom half of our sine wave. If we were to flip that around the other way, it would get rid of the top half and leave the bottom half. Half-wave rectifier. Yeah, it's good. At least it's all positive. Problem is, we've wasted half of our energy that we've paid for. This is all gone, and our average positive voltage is going to be fairly low. So, yeah, not the best of things. So what we can do is try and save that bottom part that got cancelled out. And we're going to use a full wave rectifier. And you're going to see it looking something like this. You see this quite often in tube amps. You see this quite often in solid state amps. And what it does is it takes that bottom half that was cut out and puts it up the top. So our average voltage has now gone from down here to somewhere more like up here. This is called a full wave rectifier. We have something that is all positive, but the hum and the buzz would be horrendous. If our mains power is 50 Hertz, what would be the hum frequency of the half-wave rectified signal? Come on, you over there with the glazed look on your face? Correct, 50 Hertz. Now, what is the frequency of our hum of a full-wave rectified signal? Stop combing your COVID lockdown hairstyle, young lady. The frequency? Perfect, 100 Hertz or 120 Hertz in the US. Let's have a listen to what these frequencies sound like and imagine them superimposed into whatever you're playing. Here is the 50 Hertz signal. Here is the 60 Hertz signal. Here's 100 Hertz full wave rectified noise in Australia. And here is 120 Hertz full wave rectifier noise in the USA. Let me see if I can find my little chart. Here we go. Here's my little chart. At 100 Hertz, this is in Australia, that note would be equivalent to somewhere between a G and a G sharp. Show of hands if we can think of any time a note between a G and a G sharp is going to sound good. Call out a chord that's got that. Yeah, there is none. And that's why it sounds like shit. Let's have a look at 120 Hertz. This might be better. Someone in America, call out the name of a note that's got 120 Hertz, which is somewhere between an A sharp and a B. A B flat and a B. Come on. What chord is between a B flat and a B? None, yeah? So it's just never, ever going to sound any good. That's why we have to get rid of that hum. How are we going to get rid of it? You guessed it. Capacitors. In an ideal world, our filter capacitors would be so large that they would do this to that horrendous ripple. Let me just get rid of that. You see, it's just a small amount of ripple. We can see what's happening here. The capacitor is fully charged at this point. While our rectified signal drops to 0, the capacitor is slowly discharging. And then this increasing voltage will pick it up, charge that capacitor, discharge it again as we go along like this. So that's that's a pretty good rectifier and a pretty good rectifier filter capacitor. And we get that sort of signal. But sadly, it's not going to be enough. And in the real world, we're constrained by dollars and physical size. So a smaller capacitor that looks like this, under load, when we're putting bigger demands of voltage on it, it's going to look like that. And that all of a sudden is not a pretty amount of, hang on, let me get rid of the other one. Yeah. Now we can see that ripple from a 20 microfarad filter capacitor on a silicon rectifier. And I say that because we'll come back and describe that, where the voltage of the rectifier is constant the whole time. We're going to have a serious amount of ripple. So how do we do that? How do we get over this? Well, we use bigger capacitors. We're going to go from 20 microfarad. Let's bump it up to 100 microfarad. So now at full power, you know, we got 100 microfarad at full power, and we're back to having that low amount of ripple again. Why don't we do that all the time? Well, we'll look at that. But 100 microfarads costs a hell of a lot more and is a lot bigger than 16 microfarad. Now let's look at a schematic for a Brownface Deluxe, a 6G3 Deluxe. And you'll see that it uses a 16 microfarad for the first capacitor. Not 2 years later, there were two 16 microfarad capacitors in parallel. That gives us 32 microfarads for the first filter cap in an AB763 Blackface Deluxe. Leo Fender decided that the increased cost justified the reduced hum. Yes, yes, I can hear you. Please stop yelling at the screen. Why don't we just put in huge capacitors to eliminate the hum altogether? Well, we're going to come back to that idea shortly, smartass. But first, this is a good idea to discuss capacitors and their role in an amp, and then their role in sag. What do capacitors do, and do they sag? I assume you're familiar with the symbol of a capacitor. It's two straight lines with a gap between them. Well, guess what? A capacitor is two pieces of conductive material that hold a charge with a gap between them. These two pieces of metal mustn't come into contact. So what's in the gap? Well, it could be air, or it could be a non-conductive material called a dielectric. You know the names of some of these things, like you've heard of paper capacitors, oil in paper, polystyrene, polypropylene, and so on. These refer to the dielectric material that keep those two plates apart. I think before we discuss capacitors of any further, I think we should make one. Okay, now a capacitor. You remember we just said that it's two pieces of metal, conductive metal, with something between them. Well, what do we get when there's nothing between them, when these two bits of metal come into contact? So here we've got our two plates of our capacitor, and they're coming into contact with each other, and lo and behold, that's pretty close to a short circuit. It's a pretty sensitive meter, so it's picking up resistance of all sorts of things. So let's call that a short circuit. Now, let's put our dielectric material in between. So it's just a bit of cardboard. And if they're not touching, and that cardboard is placed well and not letting it touch, there we go. Whoops, it's touching over there, I see it. Okay, so we're back to having an open circuit. Those two plates are being held apart by this bit of paper capacitor. All right, now we're going to have a look at, I'll switch things, I have to put this in to the capacitor side. Now, if my two plates come into contact when I'm measuring capacitance, once again, you know, it's not reading any capacitance. But watch what happens when I separate these two plates with some dielectric material. Turn him over. Let's put that there. And I might just weigh him down. Yeah, that'll do. Lo and behold, we have just created a capacitor. The capacitor is 0.156 nanofarads. So if we take our capacitor, our dielectric away, and remember, if they come into contact, you know what's going to happen. We got no capacitance. It's infinite capacitance. So let's build ourselves our capacitor again. You may have heard the term leakage in a reference to a capacitor. Oh, your filters are leaking, your coupling caps are leaking. And there's this thing called an ESR meter, which stands for equivalent series resistance. You can get a dedicated one like this. But we're going to simulate what an equivalent series resistance is with our capacitor. Here I have a capacitor that's 180 ohms, and I'm going to touch it there. and there, and see what it's done to our capacitance. It's ruined our capacitance. Let's put it back onto resistance measuring. Remember, we want to see open circuit for DC, which is what the meter's putting out, because it's a 9-volt battery in there. Okay, so oh yeah, let's put them back to resistance. Okay, good. So we've got no resistance between the plate. It's open circuit like a healthy capacitor is. Lo and behold, let's put in some leakage resistance, some equivalent series resistance of 180 ohms. We've now created a leaky capacitor. Ideal. No DC will pass. Leaky capacitor. We have now got a problem with this capacitor, and this capacitor would need to be changed. So that's how you make a capacitor. But how does it go from that to what we're familiar with? Well, it's easy. You grab your capacitor and you roll it up like this, never letting those plates to touch, so your dielectric's got to be in there the whole time, and a bit of mumbo jumbo magic, and there you have it. You have a nice 47 microfarad capacitor. So if that's 47 microfarad, you can imagine what 1 farad is. It would be humongous, enough energy to wipe out a whole city. No, exaggerating, but here's what a capacitor looks like. Here's a, what's this one? This one is 47 picofarad. That means it's 1/millionth of a microfarad, which in itself is 1/millionth of a farad. So that's one extreme. These you'd see in a lot of the Fender caps, Fender amps. That's, as we said, was a 47 microfarad 500. They're even smaller than that in the vintage ones. Marshall ones, they've got 2 50 microfarad capacitors in there in the one container. These are quite expensive, but thankfully a company in America has got the original manufacturing of it, and this particular multi-cap can, as they call it, this one in itself has got a 40, a 40, a 20 and a 20 microfarad all in there. Pretty expensive, something like $60 for us by the time it gets shipped out from the US of A. So why do amplifiers have capacitors? Now that you've seen a capacitor and you're now probably in big scale production making your own, you already know one of the main benefits. It separates the circuit. It stops DC from flowing from one plate to another plate. So long as that dielectric material is keeping the plates apart, it will look like an open circuit to DC. This is a very important characteristic of a capacitor. There is no direct path for the current to flow. This is particularly important for coupling capacitors, whose main job is to stop DC voltages from passing. As we saw in that homemade capacitor, if there is a leakage resistance, we got a problem. You're also going to see capacitors in tone stacks and bypass things and filters, and we might come back to that in a future video. But capacitors have another very important characteristics. All capacitors look like an open circuit to DC, but they will allow AC signals to pass, like your guitar, and the higher frequencies. And the amount of frequencies that go through will be dependent on the number of microfarads that are in the capacitor. So a larger capacitor will allow lower frequencies, higher capacitors, smaller microfarads will allow only high frequencies to go through. You can think of a capacitor as a special kind of battery that has 2 main jobs. Firstly, it's to provide sufficient voltage to your amplifier in the troughs of the rectified voltage, and to smooth out and give us as little hum as possible. Secondly, and important for our discussion, is a capacitor's ability to provide power to your amplifier when the main power supply can't keep up. A filter capacitor is like a huge battery that can provide a lot of current, but over a very short period of time. And this is why a fully charged capacitor can cause extreme cases of death. So how do you know how much energy a filter capacitor can store? Well, there's two main values that you need to be aware of. Firstly, voltage. This refers to the voltage that your capacitor is likely to see. The easiest way to see the voltage is by looking at the capacitor you're replacing. It will have a value on it. You can also look at the schematic or use your digital multimeter and read the actual value. Oh, whoa, stop. The schematic here says 450 volts, but you measured 490 volts. Any idea why the measured value may be higher than what's on the schematic? Come on, call out the answer. I know you know. No, not you again, smartass. We know what you are. Let's hear from someone else. Correct. In the USA and to a lesser extent Australia, mains voltages have increased. And so the rectified voltages have gone up as well. Let's say, for example, a 1963 Fender Concert, which is designed to have 450 volts DC on the plates. That was in the days when mains power was 110. At the present day is 120. That's an increase of 120 divided by 110, 9.1%. That means what's coming out of the power supply is also 9.1% higher. Our 450 volt on the plate is now 490. That's not good for a capacitor that's rated at 450 or even 500. It's always good engineering practice to have a voltage rating higher than it's ever likely to see. This is why Fender might specify a capacitance that's 600 volts to filter a 450 volt supply, or 490 volt was still okay. So the rule of thumb is go higher in voltage, but never pick the same or lesser voltage than on the schematic. The other number that we need to look out for is the capacitance, and this is the measure of how much charge or energy the capacitor can hold between the two plates. The charge capacity is given in that microfarad figure, and it looks like this. It's a Greek symbol. Sometimes it's easier to use the letter U or M in replacement of the Greek letter mu. Now this capacitance value is important, and unless you know what you're doing, I would not recommend going too far from the designer's specified value. You may also see some capacitors being NF, that means nanofarads, thousandth of a microfarad, or picofarad, that tiny one we saw, and that's a millionth of a microfarad. But now we'll come back to look at rectifiers and how capacitors can help a rectifier do its job. I love analogies. So in this little anecdote, we're going to look at a band scenario. The amplifier's power supply is played by the part of the roadie, and the filter capacitor is played by the guitar player. So when the amplifier is just chugging along, doing its normal thing, you know, the guitar player is just sitting back, the filter cap is just sitting back, you know, helping out every now and again. But it's the roadie that's working, but he's doing it okay. There's no grunting or swearing at this stage. But then suddenly the musician whacks a big open E chord, adds some drama. What's happening with our analogy? Well, now in our analogy, the roadie is being asked to lift a twin reverb with 2 JBLs in it. Yeah, like the one I've got on the repair bench coming up. It's got to lift that onto the workbench. It's almost there. The roadie's struggling to lift it up, but he's not going to make it. That's when the filter capacitor, played by the part of the guitar player, runs over in that last instant, goes, let me help you out, grabs the handle, and together they go, hoocha, and lift that JBL with that twin reverb with 2 JBLs onto the workbench. The guitar player, filter cap, takes the bow, goes, yes, I did it all by myself, but we know the roadie did most of the work in truth. So the filter capacitor is there to help the rectifier out when the rectifier hasn't got quite enough energy to do the job. For a short instant in time, the filter cap is going to help out that rectifier and supply that power. If the filter cap is faulty, if the filter cap is particularly underrated, it's not going to be able to help. The road, that sound is going to sag. We may expose that ripple and we're going to get a horrible, farty, not a good sound. Remember, we discussed the frequencies. So filter caps, rectifiers, they work hand in hand. They're the dynamic duo of your sound. So one could be excused for thinking that using a smaller filter capacitor for more sag or a larger filter capacitor for less sag is the answer. And in part it's true, but as always, there's a price to be paid. To understand the compromise that needs to be made in changing filter capacitors, we must first answer the question of which rectifier is best. Is it solid-state diodes or a tube rectifier? If a tube rectifier, which one? There's so many. What about a solid-state rectifier that can act like a tube rectifier? We'll come to that in the next chapter. But if you got something out of this video, could you do me a favor? Please hit the like button and subscribe. This video series took a lot of time, and by you subscribing, it shows to YouTube that I've been of service to you and you might have gotten something out of it. I hope that's the case. I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter. So until then, go and make yourself a capacitor.